Hey guys, and welcome to LBB 91 Coaching. We're talking to you guys today about why your relationship feels so intense, part two. But this time we're discussing the fearful avoidant and the anxious cycle. Yes, relationships can feel very intense when you have these two particular attachment styles. One, because they both share an intense quality. I mean, I can't use that word intense with intense. But what I really want to say to you is they both are looking for emotional intensity. This is where they both kind of bond together, where it's very different from how we see the fearful avoidant and the dismissive avoidant, in a sense of they're not necessarily bonding on the emotional intensity between a fearful avoidant and a dismissive avoidant, although it can be intense. They're not bonding over that. But the anxious person and the fearful avoidant are, because the anxious person is fighting to not be abandoned, is fighting for connection. And the fearful avoidant is fighting to be seen, to be heard, to be made known, and seeks emotional connection and through the emotional intensity. So you've got two people who really enjoy being understood through the emotional connection. And this can then create instability later on, because whilst the anxious person fears the abandonment, the fearful avoidant doesn't feel like they're good enough, whilst also simultaneously fearing the abandonment and closeness as well. So they've got a whole bunch of things going on with the fearful avoidant, which causes the very much hot and cold behaviors from the fearful avoidant. So let's talk a little bit about this in a bit more depth for you. Before I do, make sure you do me a massive favor. You're liking, you're sharing, you're subscribing, you're clicking on that wonderful bell button for the notifications of the uploads. Let's educate you today a little bit more about relational dynamics. If you don't know anything about attachment styles, it is simply the way that we emotionally bond in relationships. I've done a whole video on this, so you can go watch that. I don't want to go too deep into it, explaining all of that. But these particular two attachment styles, the anxious person is going to be looking for reassurance, and the fearful avoidant will look for reassurance too, but it doesn't trust the reassurance. And this is what creates the cycle. Because in a fearful avoidant, in an anxious person and a dismissive avoidant, the emotional intensity and need for reassurance from the anxious person is what starts off the chase and what makes the dismissive avoidant run away. They're fearing them being consumed and overwhelmed. And the fearful avoidant also has the same kind of fears. It's fearing that it's going to be consumed and overwhelmed, yes. But the flip coin is it just doesn't trust that you're going to be honest and true. Yeah, you want me, but why do you want me? Yes, you like me, but why do you like me? You say you mess with me. You're liking who I actually am, but I can't trust that to be true, because the fear for the fearful avoidant is there's going to be some level of betrayal. And so the anxious person will try to move towards the relationship, move towards connection, because it senses the fearful avoidant kind of pulling away and pulling back a little bit. And as it does that, here lies the chase that begins, the anxious and the fearful avoidant cycle. Because when the fearful avoidant pulls away, it's not going to stop there. Because once the anxious person chases and it can't catch the fearful avoidant, eventually the fearful avoidant then closes the gap. It's happy to. It wants to. They want to be able to close that gap and make themselves feel wanted and seen once more again. But then it becomes all too real and they pull away. This is what we call the hot and the cold behaviors by the fearful avoidant. So going on a bit more deeper, let's have a little bit of a reality check on this situation, because I think it is hard to understand what is going on in that type of relationship. And if you've ever been in a relationship where it has been that intense, where you felt like there is this chase going on, then you might have actually encountered this dynamic. And so the dynamic for the fearful avoidant is about being understood. It is about somebody looking beyond the mask that they may have up. I like to call it the avatar, right? Going beyond the surface and seeing them for who they are. They want that. And the anxious person is best placed for it. In fact, this particular cycle is quite similar. And I say why? Because when a fearful avoidant meets a dismissive avoidant, the fearful avoidant plays the anxious partner, trying to make seen and known the dismissive avoidant, which the dismissive avoidant loves at the beginning, because it craves to be known, to be understood, and to be seen, because it never got that in its childhood. And yet when it's the anxious and the fearful avoidant, the same principle begins again. I guess that's probably why they started off with 3 attachments first, because the fearful avoidant does mimic things that the dismissive avoidant does, because it carries both an anxious and a dismissive side of itself. And so the fearful avoidant wants to be understood and known. And the anxious person will step up to the plate and say, cool, let me try and get to know you and go deeper with you. And whilst it does that, the fearful avoidant can become emotionally sensitive. It fears rejection. It fears it fears the connection. It begins to test for safety and security, and it begins to struggle for safety within the relationship and seeks to consistently find a way to try and prove that they are safe. And those tests are a bit like Hercules doing his particular test to try and make sure that he can, I don't know, what does Hercules do? I can't remember. He did some 10 trials thing. You know what I'm talking about. But there's always going to be these tests that the fearful avoidant will do. And the anxious person seeking to be proved, seeking to be worthy, seeking to be wanted and desired, seeking to be valued and for validation will jump through the hoops. Oh yeah, it will try to jump through the hoops. And this is where the difference comes between a dismissive avoidant and a fearful avoidant, because the dismissive avoidant may do one or two, but they recognize that after a while, I'm being tested. I don't like that. What happens? The DA begins to pull away, right? Whereas the anxious person doesn't pull away. In fact, they lean into it and they seek to do these challenges. Furthermore, proving the fearful avoidant once more that, yes, I should put on more of these challenges because the anxious person is going through them and they're accomplishing them. And you may think to yourself, well, then that should make the fearful avoidant feel more comfortable that they're getting all the challenges they've set met. But the problem is that doing those things where you're testing somebody becomes an insatiable habit. You can't stop. You won't stop because there's always something that you can try and test to see if these things align. Okay, so the anxious person is going to be chasing clarity. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because the fearful avoidant creates confusion. Naturally, that's where the fearful avoidant was born. The household, the environment they grew up in had chaos and confusion. The nervous system feels great in that particular space where it's finding that there is gray areas, ambiguity. But the anxious person doesn't thrive there. This is where there's a difference again between a dismissive avoidant and the anxious person. In a dismissive avoidant's mind, ambiguity is fine because that means low stakes. You can't hold me to nothing. I can't be judged. I can't be pressurized because we've not set a standard and a goal. And this is very different to the anxious person because the moment that you don't set a standard and a goal and make things clear, the anxious person begins to fear and begins to realize that actually there may be some level of abandonment happening here and I need to be reassured and connect. And again, this births the chase for the anxious person. The fearful avoidant, again, doesn't mind the chaos. In fact, when he doesn't see chaos, it tends to create the chaos, which is where self-sabotage comes into play. The fearful avoidant is not trying to be mean or nasty. They just can't help themselves. This is how they've been trained in order to keep safety within a relationship. The nervous system will naturally feel uncomfortable with the silence and the peace. That's not what they've existed in. And therefore, they need to create chaos in order for them to feel at home once more again. So the anxious person will feel a sense of unease and a feeling of being unsafe when distance is created by the hot and cold behavior of the fearful avoidant. And the fearful avoidant will also feel a level of unease towards distance, only so much, because they're going to close the gap. And once they close the gap, they want to close the gap on their terms. Again, not being mean or nasty. They're closing the gap so that they can reconnect. They don't want to lose that connection. But as soon as they get close and the intensity begins, now it becomes an issue. See, in the beginning, the intensity was good. In the beginning, the fearful avoidant didn't fear the intensity. That's what they needed to be seen. That's what they realized made sense because that's what they've existed in when they grew up. But once they get in further down the relationship and feelings are being made known and people are expecting things, now the emotional intensity is now a thing that causes issues. Now it feels like the walls are closing in. It feels like the roof is kind of collapsing a little bit. It feels like we're being squashed and we're losing our autonomy in that space as a fearful avoidant. And again, this is going to create the dynamic of the chase once the fearful avoidant pulls away again. Okay, so the issue isn't necessarily just the emotional intensity. The issue is the emotional intensity births, or can I say, triggers the fearful avoidant to get close at first, to enjoy it, to want it, but then to pull away. And it's interesting because the same thing does actually happen with a dismissive avoidant at the very beginning. It's what happens later on, because later on, the intensity which the anxious person is going to bring, constantly wanting reassurance, trying to grab, will cause the fearful avoidant to play more of a dismissive role in the issue. So let's talk about some solutions here, because really and truly, the anxious person does need to learn how to regulate themselves so that they don't feed into the emotional intensity. The fearful avoidant also has to regulate themselves so they don't feed into the emotional intensity and avoid actually paying attention to vetting, checking, make sure this person is safe, and actually really assessing what they actually want, that then seeing if this person can align with that perspective. This is what makes relationship intense. It's the ambiguity. It's a gray. It is a not sure what this actually is that creates this heated behavior between the two of them. It looks like the anxious person may find pockets of relief. They're going to ask questions, get deep, get inside the mind of the fearful avoidant. And then all of a sudden, the door's shut again. And this creates this addictive cycle for the anxious person, where they're being rewarded for actually achieving some level of vulnerability from the fearful avoidant. But then they get crushed with the closing of that door. And this is where the anxious person can begin to be a bit more obsessive, because they're realizing, oh, it does work, but I need to do more. It does work, but I need to put in more. It does work, but I need to do this. And it's because they're looking for the control in the relationship for themselves to find what they could do physically to bring about a result. Because remember, for the anxious person, they grew up in a household where it was almost a place where they were conditionally loved. They were loved because they did something. They had to prove they were worthy. And therefore, the relationships they build must also have that same context. Hence why you might date someone that you like, but they don't necessarily like you the same way. You're having to prove yourself to the person you like actually they want you. And so let's come to the end of this aspect. The anxious person doesn't want to leave. They're fearful avoidant, fears people leaving too. But at the same time, whilst they may fear people leaving, they end up leaving themselves and causing some level of fear, some level of pain, of abandonment to the anxious person. And so this is where the anxious person can become confused over a period of time, having lent in, push back, lent in, push back, lent in, push back. It becomes in confusion after a while, and it becomes very painful as well. Okay, all right. So in order for the fearful avoidant to get to a place where they can work with the anxious person, they're going to have to learn how to be open and vulnerable. And that's tough, because you're asking the fearful avoidant to do something that comes along with pain, because remember, they associate love with harm. And so the anxious person will want the emotional access, but the fearful avoidant will fear it and kind of shun it and push it away, because they fear being actually seen for who they actually are. Okay. So let's just recap this. The reason why your relationship feels so intense is because it had spurts of a chase within it, a chaser and a runner dynamic. The anxious person is used to chasing and will run after the fearful avoidant. And actually, the fearful avoidant will actually chase the anxious person at some points, because when they fear the anxious person is tired of chasing, they will chase the anxious person in order to create that bond again and not lose it. Okay. And so this intensity of emotional, spiritual, mental, magnetic pull that you feel with this person really is a lack of boundaries and being able to stop yourself from actually pausing and saying, this is what I actually want. I'm looking at another person. I'm seeing what they're offering. This is how much they can give me. Okay, this is align with what I actually want. The fearful avoidant might come in strong and intense, and the anxious person may enjoy that, because the anxious person is used to pursuing other people. But the anxious person also too, and we can do this in another video, can also feel uncomfortable, because the fearful avoidant, if it lays it on thick, the anxious person may love the connection, but they're recognizing that they've lost their place, their need. They're used to chasing people. Now they're being chased. This can make you feel uncomfortable. Okay. So the anxious person here, while seeking for consistency, while striving for a level of normality and want and desire from the fearful avoidant, the anxious person is going to try and create clarity. And that means to define exactly what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve. Who are you? Who am I? What is it we're trying to, what is this love that we have, this affection, this appreciation we have for each other? What actually is it? And where do I stand? And when you do that, this is the only time you'll know whether the fearful avoidant actually wants you, because now the fearful avoidant has to make a choice. And they may feel like they're being trapped. And here's the thing, a fearful avoidant coming back does not mean that the anxious person, this is the right kind of person for you. The fearful avoidant coming back only proves that they like the intensity and the charm and the attraction and the vibe that you may bring to the table. But it doesn't mean they actually still want you. And you have to decide for yourself, Is this a relationship I want to be in where the person's inconsistent and can't show up consistently? If that is, then by all means, go for it. And I mean, that does mirror some of your wounds as an anxious person. The inconsistency is what you're used to, which is why you get drawn to the fearful avoidant in the first place. It is the intensity and the inconsistency. And that's probably what's going to lock you two in for a long time. Look, let's leave it on this particular aspect. Okay. And we can talk about some other things a little bit later on. Okay. The fearful avoidant will give the anxious person enough warmth for the anxious person to sit like a frog on a pan of butter that slowly warms up. Okay. The anxious person doesn't realize that it's getting colder until it's too late, because they're able to have a level of warmth from the fearful avoidant who's giving them good energy, good vibes, and seemingly giving them a good response. But the sabotage is coming soon. It's around the corner, and they don't realize this. And so as the inconsistencies start, the anxious person fights all the more harder to get in place to being closer to the fearful avoidant, because they had an aspect of openness from the fearful avoidant at the very beginning. Okay. So let's talk about some practicality, because we have to be honest and give you guys something to work with. I've already told you guys about being more secure. And I think one of the biggest things about being secure is recognizing that you have the ability to determine the speed of your interaction with somebody else. Emotional intensity bypasses the rules and the flags that we should be looking out for. And the reason being is because we're so consumed with the chemistry. We're so consumed with being obsessed. We're so consumed by the feelings we're getting in that moment. We're not paying attention to what's actually happening in front of us. And that's the anxious person as well. The anxious person has a habit of going through red lights and red flags. Why? Because they're so focused on the emotional intensity and using that as a basis of they like me, not recognizing that that is a trauma response a lot of times. So you've got to learn how to have boundaries and how to say no, and also how to be able to say, this doesn't work for me in this space right now, right? Feelings are not enough. Chemistry is not enough. Deep conversations here and there is not enough. Them coming back in and saying they want you and love you isn't enough. Change behavior is. The secure partner is able to articulate these needs and these wants that the anxious person has, that is preventing the fearful avoidant from getting closer and committing. So here's one sentence I can say for you guys before we get off from an anxious perspective. I care about this connection, but I'm not comfortable staying in uncertainty. I am open to moving slowly, but I need honesty, consistency, and clear communication. I'm not asking you to rush, but I'm asking you to not keep me confused. If you need space, communicate it early. And if you're unsure, be honest, but I cannot build emotional safety around mixed signals. And that really is the truth. You can't build a relationship on flags that are waving ambiguously. You need to know exactly what you're standing on. Ain't that interesting? Anyway, listen, that's my little thoughts there. Let us know down below in the subsection your comments, your thoughts. How do you see the intensity between the anxious and the fearful avoidant? We'd love to hear your perspective and your experiences. Much love, much appreciation. We'll see you soon.